Looks like we've got quite a few people here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Tech Tuesday. As I've said before, my name is Tom Levine. I am Cornerstone's Excel expert and techie here. So any question you have about Excel, please feel free to type it in the questions section during our presentation, and I will likely answer it near the end of the presentation. If you have any question pertaining to something that we're covering, please feel free to type it in the question box. If I see it, I will respond to it as it's typed in. If it's not exactly related to what we're covering, I'll probably save it till the end. Just a quick note before we go through some of the other bookkeeping. Last week, or the last Tech Tuesday that we did, we had a few technical errors. And as a result of that, I re-recorded that webinar. If you're looking for a little bit more of a clear walkthrough of what we covered in the first webinar, which was general syntax, which is how to type and explain cell references in Excel, as well as some general manipulation tactics, I would highly recommend going back onto our website and checking that out. Just some other bookkeeping notes. As I said, please feel free to type a question in the questions box right there. It's highlighted in red on your screen right now, or at least I believe it is. If you have any questions, please type them in the box. I will definitely get to it. Another thing to mention is that Cornerstone Resource Center. We simplified it and changed our website up for 2020, so it's a little bit different. If you go onto our Resource Center and go into the webinar section, it's displayed right up there, then you'll be able to find all the recordings of our webinars. Like I mentioned before, we re-recorded last week's webinar, or the last Tech Tuesday, so I'd highly recommend checking that if you want a more thorough view. Also, one other thing to mention, we have our Cornerstone 2021 incentive program in operation right now. The top qualifier, meaning the #1 salesman, is going to receive $5,000, and there's also a raffle going around. One lucky qualifier is going to win a weekend getaway to the destination of their choice. Brokers can qualify for this program by signing up on our website. You can register online at www.crnstone.com/2021 incentive. The qualifying period is between January 1st, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. And we're actually operating it on a point system. You get points for selling individual medical and ancillary sales, I believe, as well as some group policies. You need to have a minimum of 2,000 points earned in order to be eligible for one of the cash rewards that are shown on the screen right here. And our top 20 brokers are going to be earning cash prizes. So I'd highly recommend registering for that. I do already see one question up. Sherry, we will get to that at the end of the presentation, so stay tuned. So I said it before we started recording. However, if you have any questions or would like to follow along, I'd highly recommend downloading the handouts that I've included. This is one titled an Excel sample workbook and another titled Excel sample workbook completed. If you download the sample workbook, you'll be able to follow along with exactly what I'm doing throughout the webinar. And if you download the sample workbook completed, that shows what the workbook will be like at the very end of our third presentation. So I definitely recommend downloading that to follow along. Additionally, we also have a notes page and syntax notes page here on this sample workbook document. This sample workbook sort of goes through a lot of the general questions that kind of get asked in Excel. Things like, why aren't my functions or formulas working? How do I tell Excel to add and subtract? And things like that, as well as some other general notes in here. We also have some technical terms that I'm going to actually define before we get started going through the demonstration, as well as some other notes that I'd like to cover, just to make this page a little bit more clear. First off, we're going to go through some of the syntax or general tech term notes. The first being what a string is, because I'm going to reference that a lot in this presentation. A string is a list of characters, numbers, or symbols within a cell. That could be anything, for example, a $, A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, which I'm typing into cell F9 currently. This section right here is sort of a good description of what a string could be. A string is pretty much any list of data. When I say value, however, I'm referring to the results string that's within a cell. What that means is the value of the cell is not necessarily what's typed up here in the formula box or what the string in the cell actually is. That might become a little bit more clear as we go through our presentation. A formula, however, refers to any operation or expression that calculates or processes values. This could be anything like addition or subtraction. Anything that you type into Excel generally using these basic operations that I've highlighted is considered a formula. And a function is slightly different. A function, which we'll mostly be covering today, is a type of formula that's pre-built into Excel. Typically, these are called up by keywords. Nested functions we're actually going to be covering in the next webinar as well. I have a list of helpful functions underneath this definition section as well. We're going to cover a lot of these today, at least a lot of these general useful functions, but these are the functions that I use most frequently, and these are the functions that I think will probably help people most often. I have the formula section here, which shows sort of how it will show up here in this bar. I'm going to circle it as well, just so people know where I'm talking about. This section here displays the exact string that's typed into a cell. And if you're using a formula, this is what will appear when you click on a cell in this bar. This is actually what's typed into the cell, not the value that's being displayed. So it's important to take a look there whenever you have a cell highlighted. Additionally, all of these example sections here all of these examples right here that I have highlighted right now use the table below as an example. This here is just the reference table, and then at the other side of the arrow is what the formula would export based on what's in the parentheses in here. For now, we're going to actually get started. So if you have any other questions on syntax or basic operations, please feel free to type it into the box and I'll answer you near the end of the webinar. We have a few different tabs in this sample document, and I'm going to briefly walk you through them. The first is this reference file tab. This is the table that we're going to be pulling data from into our working file. Whenever you're working a statement or something in Excel where you have a base document and then you have something that you're manipulating in the data table, you're going to want to have a reference file and a working file. The reference file is going to be the base file that you have downloaded, and the working file is going to be the file where you do all your work. If you're using Excel to do accounting, it's also a good idea to put any sort of related data in your reference file, and then your working file just sort of shows your results or what you're trying to display. That's something that I highly recommend because it helps you sort of keep data arranged in a better way, and it also helps you to understand exactly what work you've done and what data you were provided with. Getting started here, I'm first going to show you an example of what a formula would be. Like I said before, a formula is any basic operation that would be done in Excel. Basic operations include things like addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, those sorts of processes. For example, if I'm typing a formula and I want to add together some of the cells that we have displayed in box N602. I know I'm referencing that box because I'm in column N and row 602. When I say that, I'm referring to the numbers on the side of the screen here for the row and the letters for the column. Excel's syntax, which is just generally how you type a formula, refers to things by first their column and then by the row. If you type it in reverse, Excel won't know what you're talking about. Whenever you're starting to work with a formula or a function, you're going to want to make sure you start typing with an equal sign. If you don't include that equal sign, Excel's just going to refer to the data table that you're referencing, and it's going to give you an error. I will show you an example of that in a second. But if I wanted to add cells 601 and 600 together, I would type equals, click on cell 601, hit the plus key on my keyboard, and then click on cell 602. To a lot of you, this may seem pretty basic, but this is the most general formula that you can do to add. You can also string this together as much as you want and add multiple cells just by hitting plus and clicking. If I hit enter then, this adds together all of these cells. Something that's a little trickier, however, is just general order of operations. If any of you've taken a math class probably within the last 20 years, you might have heard of the operation reference PEMDAS, which is PEMDAS, and that refers to how Excel also thinks about order of operations. First parentheses, then exponents, then multiplication, then division, then PEMD, division, addition, and then subtraction. Addition would be one of the last operations that it does as a result. If I were to change this up a little bit, and I'm just going to use 3 cells to make my example a little more clear. If I want to add 6 and 2 together and divide that result by 2, that would be 8 divided by 2. I'm looking for 4. If I just do equals 6 plus 2 divided by 2, I get 7, not 4. The reason that it's doing that is because it's thinking whatever is in cell 601, which is 2, is first getting divided by 2 and then added to 6. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and then plus 6 is 7. So that's why we're coming up with 7. In order to tell it that I want to add first, I would need to put in these parentheses right here. This tells Excel to first add these 2 values together and then divide by cell N599, which is 2. As you can see, now our value is 4. This is something to remember because it's also how Excel deals with functions specifically. And functions are mainly what we're going to be covering today. One of the first functions that I learned specifically was the round function. Round is very useful if you're dealing with really large data sets and you're trying to get rounded values from carriers that don't. If you look through the total paid column right here, you see a lot of values listed, and those values are all only 2 digits long after the decimal place. You can change what's being displayed, however, by clicking on these buttons up here. First, you have to highlight your range of data. All I did was hit Control-Shift and press the down arrow key, and that automatically selects all of the data that is below the cell you have selected, including the cell you have selected. Once again, that was Control-Shift down once I had data selected. And I'm pretty sure you can already see up here in this box, which is called the formula bar, that even though cell O2 is the specific cell I have selected, the value being displayed isn't 4.50, it's 4.501, which means that any sort of addition we're doing or any sort of subtraction we're doing, anything isn't going to base itself off of 450, but rather that 450 and 1/100ths of a dollar. If I insert a column here, which I did by clicking on the column Q, right-clicking, and then just hitting Insert, then I get the option of adding data next to my total paid section here. I'm going to call this corrected total paid. And before I do, I'm just going to scroll through some of these values. As you can see just from the top 3, they're already not really displaying what's in the box. One of the things that I like to do in order to just generally verify this, if I highlight column O, and if you're following along, that's what you'll want to have selected without this top total paid menu selection, otherwise it won't work. I'm going to click the increase decimal button up here in the home section. And as you can see, it increases the displayed decimal place by several. What this does is it allows you access to view in the cell a little bit more of what's actually happening. So now that I've done that, we can see not all these values are perfectly rounded. In order to fix this, we're going to do something called adding a function into the box. And there are two different ways to do it. So I'm going to do it both ways first. If you're kind of new to using formulas, you're going to want to use the first method that I'm showing. And if you're kind of an old hand at formulas, you're going to want to manually type these into the box. That's what I normally do. And it helps you to become more familiar with common errors in formulas. You can access a formula wizard to insert a formula by clicking on this insert function button, or insert function, I apologize, right here, this insert function button, or you click on the drop-down, more functions, and then you get access to this formula wizard, or function wizard, my apologies. This is the same if you do that AutoSum method I just did, or if you click on that function button right there. What this function button does is it brings up the general function insert wizard. And as you can see, it starts for me with round up at the top, but it might not for you. Typically, if you're new to accessing this, it'll have sum first. If you click on this drop-down button, it gives you access to a lot of different sorted types of functions. You can use the all function here, which is normally what I select, to show all of the functions total in all of Excel, which are just preloaded formulas. If you're looking for something specifically for financials, you could look in here. And if I have a function selected, it shows in here the formula that's going to populate into your box. And underneath here, what that function actually does. For this function, accrue int, it returns the accrued interest for a security that pays periodic interest. What we're looking for, however, is the round function. If it's not at the top of your screen under all, which it probably isn't, you can either scroll through this box using this scroll icon here to find round, or you can type the function you're looking for in this search box. We're looking for a round, and I'm gonna hit go now. And as you can see, it brings up any function in Excel that can round a number. Specifically, I use round. Round down automatically rounds downward, but round uses typical rounding rules, which is what you're going to want to use. There are a bunch of other functions in here, as you can see, and I'm not going to cover them all because there's just too many. But I'd highly recommend looking through some different functions other than the ones I display here, and you might be able to find something that you're looking for. But most often, if you're trying to round, you're going to want to use round. And then I'm going to hit OK. This brings up the function arguments. What it means by arguments is any sort of input that is required for the function to run. As you can see, we have two different fields here, number and num digits. And if I click on one of these options, you see that number is the number you want to round. You can enter the number physically into here, or what I always do using formulas, you can reference it relatively. What that means is you can enter a cell reference, and it will round that cell or whatever value is in that cell. So we're going to round option O2, or cell O2 in this case. I did that by just clicking on the cell I'm referencing. One thing to note though, before you move on to your next argument in the function, you can either get there by hitting enter, which will tell you too few arguments for the function because you don't have everything in there. Or if you exit out of it and try to Control Z, you still won't be able to get back to the wizard. What I want you to see is that you're going to have to enter all of the arguments into the function. Otherwise, it's going to give you an error. If we get back into our round function, which now should be at the very top because it's most recently used, and hit OK, I can either click the cell, I can physically type the cell that I'm looking at, which is O2, and it'll register it exactly the same way. It just won't pop up with that display until we click off of it or run the function. And then we have the number of digits that it's going to display here. This one you're going to have to manually type in. We're going to use the number of digits 2 because we're rounding to the hundredths place. The hundredths place being the second section after the decimal. Because I hit 2 here, it rounds to the nearest hundredths. As you can see down here, it also shows us the result. This result of this round function is going to be 4.5 because 4.501 rounds to 4.5. If I entered 0 into this, it will round so there is 0 after the decimal place, 0 number of digits, and that would round 4.501 directly to 5. And if I put 1 in here, our result will be the same. That won't always be the case, however. If we look at cell O4, as you can see when I clicked, it automatically did addition, which is something to be aware of as you're entering your arguments. Then we're going to end up rounding incorrectly if we just had 1. So we want to include 2 here. I'd recommend rounding to 2 if you're doing any sort of financial analysis. Not only does it spit out the answer here, it also has what the formula is going to do. I'm going to circle that section here, right here. In addition, it also has a description of what the argument we're going to input does, right there. In that section, I bracketed in red. To show you an example, if I click off of that and go back to number, it shows number is the number you want to round, and number of digits is the number of digits to which you want to round. I'm going to hit OK now, and when I hit OK, it runs the function. As we can see, the value being displayed is 4.50. That's because I rounded the value of total paid to 2 decimal places. If I click the bottom corner of my box now and drag that formula all the way to the end of my data range and let go, it extends that function all the way down. If we look in our formula bar, this is the formula that's actually being displayed. The formula round, our cell reference here, and the number it's trying to round to. As we drag down, it automatically extends that cell reference all the way down as well. The reason for that is because of the syntax that we used in our cell reference here. If I, instead of O2, put something like a $sign here on the value 2, and then rounded down, or extended my formula down the range, as you can see, all of these values are now 4.50. The reason for that is because of that $sign that I added into our cell reference up here. When you're dragging a formula, if you don't want a part of the cell reference to change, you're going to have to add that $sign. For example, if I inserted 2 more columns, and we're going to delete this in a second, and then dragged this round function over to the right. As we can see, our values are still 4.5. That's what's being displayed in the cell. However, if we look at our actual formula bar, the first argument of that function, which is this chunk here, is now referencing cell P2. And the cell that we put in R is now referencing Q2, which is the cell before it. The reason that it's doing this is I didn't add a $ before the column reference. If I wanted to make sure that it did not change that column reference, I would add the $ before the column reference of our cell, and then I would drag that to the right instead. If I scroll over the formulas and click on the formula bar now, as we can see, the exact string that we've entered into cell Q2 is now still referencing cell O2. And if I hit tab again, our formula is still referencing cell O2 because I put the $ in front of the column reference. I'm going to go ahead and delete these and change the value of this to no locked reference. And then the other way that I'm going to extend formulas down in this is just double clicking on this lower right-hand corner of the selected cell. When I do that, it automatically extends the formula down the range as well instead of clicking and dragging. That generally is what you'd want to do for some general formulas as far as rounding values. Another common one when you're referencing values is the sum function. Previously, when we entered a formula into a box, we had to add cells by clicking and then hitting plus, clicking and then hitting plus. What the sum function does, and this is the other way that we can enter functions, is I can just hit equals, type the name of the function I'm looking for. In this case, it's sum, and then beginning parentheses. What that does is that tells Excel to use the sum function. So once you're more familiar with formulas, instead of using the function wizard, you can just start typing them. It doesn't even have to necessarily be in all capitals. It just recognizes by equals the name of the function and the beginning of a parenthesis that we're starting to use a function. It also will display those arguments that I mentioned using the formula wizard in these sections up here. It also has a little hyperlink here under the argument that we're entering into the function. Each of the arguments, when you're manually typing in a function, is going to be separated by a comma. And if I click the hyperlink there, for some reason it's not displaying. I think that's because we haven't fully finished. But whenever you start hovering over it, typically what it will do is it'll display the full description of what you're trying to display. If I type 1 in here, for example, and I click on this hyperlink, it'll highlight 1 as our argument. You can still use the clicking and hitting the plus method to use the sum function to click on each of the individual cells. However, the power of the sum function is that you don't actually have to use the plus in order to add things. You can simply click and drag along a reference range for what you're trying to add together. And if we drag all the way to the top, then we can see that we've highlighted the range P2 to P601. I know that because of this colon right here. Whenever you're using a cell reference range, this colon here in the middle will represent that you're trying to get a range of data, in this case from cell P2 to cell P601. The other thing that I could do is manually type in the range. Instead of clicking and dragging, I can simply type into my argument P2 to P601. And as I can see right here, the blue box is populated, which is a little bit different from the argument entering wizard that we used before, and it shows highlighted the cell range that I'm referencing. The other thing that I could do, if I'm trying to then add other specific cells after that range that I have highlighted, is I'm going to hit comma, and then I get the argument number 2 for the function. In the sum function, all the arguments are cell reference ranges or specific values. I could do 1, for example, as just a solid value, and it will add that number 1 to whatever values are included in our reference range. Additionally, instead of 1, I could simply click on another specific cell that I want to add in. As we can see, that cell reference is colored in differently than the original range. It'll try to color each of these ranges uniquely, but it only has a certain number of different colors that it can select. So you're going to want to make sure as you go through these ranges that you're not just looking at color, but what specific cells it's referencing. And then I'm going to close off my function by hitting that closed parenthesis. That's actually a good question, Deanna. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. We had a question that says, does it highlight if you're using the cell wizard versus entering manually and outlining the cells? It does highlight if you use the cell wizard, but only if you're clicking the cell references and dragging. It doesn't do that if you're manually entering the cell references into the wizard. That's a very good question. So then I'm going to hit enter, and it automatically brings us back to the cell that we were entering our formula in right above, and it selected the cell beneath that cell. If you have a range highlighted and start pressing enter, by the way, it will cycle through the range you have selected, top to bottom, and then left to right. But as we can see through this sum, it's added all of range P, and I know that because if I click on this formula bar, it automatically pops up the cell references, versus if I just click on the cell and don't click on the formula bar, it will just show physically typed what cell references are included in the function. Now, that covers sum and round, which are the two main functions you're going to use. However, if you're like me and do any statement processing, you also know that you're going to have to manipulate strings of data. Strings of data, again, referring to specific lengths of data. To explain this, I've included a few different cells. I have A, B, and C specifically that we're going to use a function called concatenate on. What concatenate does is it actually takes values in strings of cells and pushes them together. It's also a good example if I'm going to show you a little bit more syntax, which is one of the things that we're really going to cover a lot of in this, because syntax is very, very important to entering functions. If I click on the cell D2 and go into the function wizard, which is what we're going to use to display concatenate, I can go to all, type concatenate, and hit go. That's spelled CONCATENATE if you're trying to search for it. What concatenate does is, as the description implies, join several text strings together into one string. If I click on my function and hit OK, as you can see, it gives us text1, text2, and so forth as the arguments. I wish I could adjust the window size so that you can read it a little better, but the full description of what each of these does for the arguments, once again, is located right here. The explanations can sometimes be a little bit convoluted, but what concatenate does for each of the arguments is it references a cell. When using concatenate, it's helpful not to reference a large range of cells, but rather to reference specifically one cell, then another cell, then another. If you reference a range, it'll actually give you an error. And if I erase all my drawings real quick and just show you what will happen if I do that in text1, if I join the range A2 to C2 and hit OK, it'll tell me value hashtag. Whenever a value is displayed as a result of a function that has that hashtag in front of it, it's telling you that there's an error with what you've typed into the function and that your arguments are not being referenced correctly for the function that you're trying to run. As a result, it gave me that hashtag value. There's also this little diamond with an exclamation point next to the data that I've typed in incorrectly. If I click on that dropdown, it shows that there's an error in value right here in gray, and I can click Help on this error. What that'll do is it'll open up a separate window within Excel, and it'll show you a little bit more specifically what's going on with that error. As you can see from the top, we're doing all of this in Excel 2010, which is very similar to the currently supported version of Excel. The only real difference is that your menus will look a little bit different. So Office 365 is what everyone's currently using. If you're working in 2010, that's probably still fine. It just means that the general expert support help for Excel is going to be ending, or it has already ended. I haven't fully checked on that, my apologies. But it explains specifically this error here as well. If you ever run into a problem with an error and you don't know what it's trying to tell you, it'll explain that more specifically here. You can also use this wizard here to search for different problems. If I hit concatenate, I can click on this link and that'll open a full internet view for what exactly is going wrong with this. And you can see more specifically the errors here. But for us, the hashtag value is coming up because we have an invalid reference for one of our arguments. If I go back into the wizard for concatenate, I do that by clicking there and clicking concatenate since it was our most recently run function, and hit OK, I can get back into the wizard. The reason that it gave us that error is because we want to reference individual cells that we're trying to join together. If I click on Adams, then move to text 2 and click on John and hit OK, it gives us Adams, John. The reason that it has spaces in here, by the way, is because there are spaces indicated in the string for John. I know that because up here in this function, I have spaces before the value is typed, meaning those will carry over as well. If I drag this function down one more box, you can see that it also has Adams, Dan right here. In order to fix the commas not being added in, if I'm trying to phrase things as last first, and I'm using this function wizard here, I can manually add that in. What I would have to do is click the box of the first value I want to have, manually enter in a comma, and then click on box 3. I'm also going to note what actually popped into box 2 was quotation mark, comma, quotation mark. And if I hit OK and look at the actual contents of our formula up above, we can see the actual arguments for our function are cell B2, quotation mark, comma, quotation mark, and then C2. The reason for this is whenever you're entering a specific string, that kind of excludes numbers, but if you're entering something that you're trying to format as text, then you're going to want to make sure you input that as that quotation mark there. If I hit enter, I look here and I see that I've added a comma between the value of cell B and the value of cell C now. If I drag it down, however, as you can see, there's no space after our comma. The way you'd normally edit that, if you're just using the wizard, is you'd delete the entire concatenate function, go back into the wizard, and then remember to type a space after your comma. However, because I know that this argument here is just whatever string of text or values I want it to be in quotation marks, all I have to do is hit a space and then drag that function down. I'm gonna do that one more time here. And because I added that space and then dragged the function down, it added spaces between Adams and Dan in cell D3 and so on and so forth. That's a good way to concatenate the names and get a phrase that is a little bit better. Another thing that you could do in order to remove some of these spaces, just using the cell for John as an example, is use the trim function. I'm going to manually type this one in instead of using the wizard. But if you're using the wizard, it would do similar box population. If I hit equals and start typing trim, you can see the formulas that pop up down below. This is Excel trying to guess the function that we're trying to enter. Instead of physically typing the full one, this time I'm just going to double click on trim. As you can see, that physically popped up the rest of the trim function beginning syntax that I needed. Now you see that the trim function just has one argument, text. If it did have multiple arguments or the possibility of multiple arguments, it would string those out. For example, if I add sum instead into this box, I see number 1, number 2, and dots, meaning it can add multiple more arguments. However, I'm just going to use trim. What trim specifically does, and because I didn't use the wizard, it didn't give you a full description, but what trim does is trim actually cuts off all the spaces at the front and the back end of a string, but typically not the spaces in the middle. The reason I say this specifically is because it will do spaces. Specifically, it'll remove a lot of spaces from your data. However, one thing that it won't do is it won't remove tabs. For instance, if instead of this box, I had spaces here in front of John, I did tab in the actual value here, which it's not going to let me do because I'm not holding the right key. Or if I had a wide range of spaces here in the middle. It'll cut out the extraneous spaces, but it won't cut out one of them. It'll think, oh, you're just trying to use one space, right? If I add a comma here, then it will add the space, comma, space. It just cuts out extraneous ones. So if you're trying to make sure that your concatenating has no spaces, you would first want to run a trim function on your data. And then instead of cell C2 here, I'm just going to click on our cell reference for C2 and drag it into cell D instead. And then I would double click to extend that down. Similarly, if I wanted to do that for the value here in last, I could do the same thing. This time we're going to use the function wizard. I hit function, I go to all, and I search for trim. And as you can see, the trim function removes all spaces from a text string except for single spaces between words. And then I hit OK. I click on the cell that I want to trim all the spaces off of, hit enter, extend that cell all the way down, and then change my reference from B2 to C2. I could do that by clicking and dragging on the physical box for the cell reference like I did. I could also resize that by manually clicking and dragging like so. Or I could just physically type in this argument, C2, and hit enter. Then I would double click down the line and it extends that all the way to the bottom of the data field, as you can see. So now we have a concatenated first and last name, and they don't have spaces. Another specific function that you'd use on a string of text other than concatenate, for example, are the left, right, and mid functions. Oh, before we get to that though, we do have a good question from Rick Leibold. If you created a trim function for column C and then deleted that column, would you end up with an error? Well, why don't we just go ahead and do that then, just to show you. As you can see, this is referencing cell C2. And if I delete column C, we do get a different error. That error is a reference error because the box that it was referencing no longer exists. It's a very good question, Rick. But if I hit Control Z, I can also undo that. And then we no longer have those reference errors in our concatenate. Either way, moving on. We also have functions for dealing with strings as well, being left, right, and mid. I'm going to start with left and right and then explain mid over here. So we're going to do left first. And what left does is if I do equal left, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to use the box one for this because it might make a little bit more sense. If I type left and hit go, then click on the left function, I can see it has two arguments. It has text and num characters. This operates very similarly to the round function. However, it specifically applies to a string of text starting at the left and returns the number of characters starting at the left that we want. This includes spaces as well, by the way. So unless you do a trim on your data first and then you do the left function, it'll include those spaces. First argument is text. I'm going to use this concatenate box right here, Adams John, as my reference text. And as you can see, the result of that first argument is specifically the string Adams John. Adams John refers to what the actual output of that concatenate function was, not the entire concatenate function. So when you're doing things like this step by step, you're going to want to think through it in columns, step by step by step. There are ways around this, however, that we're going to get into in Excel 301 once you're more familiar with these functions, and I'd recommend using them incessantly to sort of get them down under your fingers before we get into our next session. That's going to be the solution to doing multiple columns and having those reference errors appear. Anyway, if we want to go from the left to the right, we want to export the left string, and we want it to be the first 3 characters in the string starting from the left. Then I would enter 3 into the number of characters. As you can see, it's just the number of characters we want to extract from the left, and then hit OK. One thing I also want to make sure you see real quick before I hit go is this section here. That means that if I don't type in the value for 3 in number of characters, or I don't specify, it will only return the first character in that left function. But I'm going to show you the results of that too, so you can sort of visualize it here in a moment. I'm going to erase all my drawings, go back to my normal selection mode, and hit OK. As we can see with the left function, it spit out the left 3 values in the string Adams John. If I delete the 3 and the comma and just hit enter, it does the first function from the left. If I'm doing right instead of left, and I'm just going to type this one out, click on the cell I'm trying to reference, and then type 3, it actually gives us the first 3 values on the right. And then mid is a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to do this in the function bar. Either way, right and left, the only difference is where you start in the string. If I'm looking for mid is a little bit different than left or right, because instead of starting from the far left or the far right of a string, it starts wherever we specify in the string. What that means is we not only have our text argument, we also have the number of characters we'd like to start from the left side over in the string, and then we have the number of characters we'd like to export. I'm going to hit OK. We're going to use Adams John again as a reference. And we're going to start, let's say, at the 3rd character in. Now, it doesn't specifically export right now what character that refers to. However, if we're starting from the left in the string that's displayed, which in this case is what's in quotation marks here, Adams, John, it's going to start from the third character in that string within the parentheses. That means ADA. A is our third value right here. And that means that we're referencing that letter A is where we're going to start the export of our string. Then it asks me for the number of characters I want to export. This is the exact same thing we were doing for the left and the right functions, which is the number of characters from this reference string that we're trying to take out. If I use 3 characters here as well, then it also shows me the result down here, which is AMS. The reason is because if I start at this A and count from the left to the right, 3, that's AMS. And that's what's going to be displayed by the mid function when I hit OK. And it'll do the exact same thing if I extend it all the way down as well. Those are probably the most used string functions that you're going to use in general. I'm going to Control Z and name that mid for you as well. However, these functions, if you'd like to keep them in, you certainly can. You can always reference them by using the wizard and trying to go through exactly what arguments they have. Or in my formula and syntax notes, right up here, I also have full explanations of these formulas as well. When I'm moving on to the pivot table and whatever we're going to reference here in a moment, I'm going to go ahead and delete these from my data, except for the last comma first column. And then I'm going to rectify this by this concatenate function, that is, by manually hitting B2 and C2 here as well. This just helps my data that I'm displaying right now match the data from our reference file a little bit easier for the next function that we're going to use, and that's VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP is probably the most used function that I use in the entirety of Excel. What it does is it compares a value that you specify from a cell that you specify to a reference table. And then using that reference table, it spits out data as well. It's similar to concatenate, or not concatenate, I'm sorry, but it's similar to trim in that it manipulates sets of data. It doesn't specifically give you a value. If I see all the way over here to the right of our working file, the last column that I have in this is called carrier. And if I go to our reference file here and scroll all the way to the right, we have all of these fields over here. That's med, dent, viz, life, LTD, STD, AD&D, supplemental life, and critical illness. And these are obviously lines of business. This data chart indicates specifically what each client has as far as the line of business and what it pertains to the rate of payment. Oftentimes when you're getting a statement, you'll have a lot of these sort of policy descriptions listed. And if you want to display something from one table on another table, and you want to make sure those specifically reference specific data, then you're going to want to use a VLOOKUP. I use them all the time in order to pull different policy numbers that might be different, or different phrasing of policy numbers, for example, or formats from a database into the cell or the entire data table that I'm working with. It can also be very useful if you're trying to double check data, and I will show you how to do that in the third webinar because it involves nested functions. But let's say, for example, I wanted to move all of this data here, med to critical illness in our reference file, over to our working file. The formula that I'm going to use for that is called VLOOKUP. And I'm going to do it first using the function box here, and then by manually typing it, because I think that manually typing it is going to give you a fully better idea of how the function actually works. If I click the function box and start typing V L-O-O-K-U-P, and hit go, then it'll give me a bunch of the lookup functions. The one that I typically recommend using is VLOOKUP. There's also HLOOKUP, which does the same thing that VLOOKUP does, except it's based on our column references instead of our vertical column references. So that's row reference versus column. I apologize if I misspoke. But VLOOKUP compares a value that we're going to specify in the leftmost column of a table, and then returns a value in the same row from a column you specify. This last line here is the most important part of this description, by the way, because it says by default, the table must be sorted in ascending order. And I'll explain what that means here in a moment. The first value that we're going to need to look at is our reference value, or our lookup value. This refers to a value on our table that we want our table array to compare and export. If I go all the way to the left, the most unique value, which is what you're going to want to use in any sort of VLOOKUP function, is going to be our line number in this example. You can also do VLOOKUPs based on policy numbers, but because sometimes you have repeats of policy numbers in the data you're trying to display, typically I add line numbers to my base data and then use a VLOOKUP to compare to the line numbers in our working file. I already did this for you, but if you're using a data table that's a base and it's exactly matching the data table you want to export data to, you're going to want to use a line number reference instead of any other type. If you're trying to do things like policy number references, then that's a little bit different. But in this example, we're going to use line number. I'm going to click on cell A1 here because I'm also trying to export the header that we had in our original table. Typically, you won't be doing that. Typically, you're going to rename your header and then use the data below. Then it gives us this table array. And as we can see, the table array is an argument of the function that references a table of text, numbers, or logical values in which data is retrieved. The table array can be a reference range or a range name. And we haven't explained range names yet, so I'm not going to cover exactly what that means. For now, all you need to know is that you can specifically name cell ranges, like what we had with those colons in one of my previous explanations, and use that instead of the table array reference. However, I never use a named range when I'm doing this, specifically because I like to have more control over what table I'm referencing. In order to change this tab that we're working in, I just click on reference file. And as you can see, that populated the reference box with single quote, reference space file, single quote, exclamation mark. What that's telling Excel is that the name of the sheet or tab that we're using is reference file. It knows that by indicating the single quotes there. And then it's telling Excel that it's a sheet with that exclamation mark. If I scroll all the way to the left and highlight from the line option of my header, all the way over to the final range that we want to export from our base data, and then all the way down to the bottom range and let go. Then we have range reference, but it's double doing this reference file here, and it will give us an error. That's another reason why when I'm using the VLOOKUP, I prefer to manually type and select things because it tends not to do that double range file reference or reference file reference. Before moving on, you're going to want to make sure that you reference specifically one table array. And if I hit, if I hit Control Z, it's not going to undo. But if I add any sort of data here, another way to double check that I've input the right argument is that if it's going to give me an error based on my argument, this argument field comes up blank. If I backspace over it, however, and my range is a valid range to reference, it'll give me this row here. And what this is the actual headers of the range that I've selected. Column index number, and if I click on that in the box, it automatically jumps me back to the table for the cell that I'm trying to put my formula into. For column index number, however, we want a solid number, not a general reference. What column index number is specifically is the column number in the table array from which the matching value should be returned. What that means is, specifically with this table, I'm beginning my reference in column A and extending all the way to column Y. Therefore, for my column index number, I'm going to count from column A to column Y for this number. It's specifically referencing the number from left to right that you're trying to export as far as the column is concerned. If I manually count this out, which might help any confusion on this, if I start in A, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And as you drag, you can see this number 12 is extending next to C. That's a count of how many columns I have referenced. And if I highlight up to what we're trying to export currently, which is this medical column, I can see that the column we're trying to export is 17 columns away from our initial table input. If I were, instead of A2 to Y602, referencing B2 to, or Q, I apologize, to Q602, I would, instead of from A, start at column B and then drag that along. In this case, the number we'd want to enter into this is 16, not 17. But either way, for the column index for this specific cell, we want to input 17. Now already it's telling me the result of this, and that's because the final box here is technically an optional argument for our VLOOKUP. Personally, I don't think it is. There are two options for what you can put into this box, and it's a logical reference, which I will explain again in our next webinar, exactly what that means. But what it's looking for in this box is true or false. If I look at the range lookup explanation, I don't think it actually really helps explain what this box does. It says the range lookup is a logical value to find the closest match in the first column, sorted in ascending order, equals true if omitted, find an exact match, equals false. What that means is that if I put true into this box, it'll only tell me any near match to number 1. For example, it could match not just to number 1, but if our number we were trying to base our lookup off of was 10, it would also, instead of giving me the range 10, or the value that corresponds with 10 in our table, give me the column 1 instead. I always type false because it means we only want exact matches from our table. Then I'm going to hit OK. As you can see, that gave me med up here in R. And if I extend that all the way down the line, as we can see, the VLOOKUP extends to all of our data. The one thing that I wanted to mention though, and the reason why I always enter these manually, is this reference range up here. Remember earlier in our presentation when I said if you want to lock a value, you add $signs to a range of data. If I extend down, I see that our reference files table has changed as I drag this. It becomes a lot more evident if we drag to the right. As you can see from my drag to the right, it hasn't really changed anything. And if I extend down, it doesn't look like it changes much actually either. What it does change, however, indicated by the error, is our reference file reference, as well as our base cell reference, but it doesn't change this solid number 17 for our column index number. This means that the VLOOKUP is running off of data that we didn't want it to. For example, the VLOOKUP in this current cell, if I backspace over this, which is column S, cell 9, is looking instead of our initial A reference for A1, is looking at cell B9. And it's looking at the table that is in reference file B10 to Z610. Visually, if I click on our reference file, again, backspace over, our duplicate name, what that means is it's referencing cell B10 all the way to cell C or Z609, which is not what we want in our VLOOKUP. That's why I typically manually type my VLOOKUPs in. If I edit this a little bit so I can actually leave the function reference and then go back into our first column here, the way that I would add my dollar signs to make sure that it's referencing specifically what I want is first, I would add a dollar sign to my reference column. This means that no matter where I extend it, it will always reference whatever value is in column A within the row number that I want. Then I would also add a dollar sign to A2 in our cell reference and Y602 in our cell reference. Technically speaking, I didn't need to add the dollar signs to that last part because no matter how I change my range after that A2 gets locked in, that changes the initial, that just expands my reference table. It wouldn't ever actually move it from locking into cell A2 as our first cell reference for the range. Just for example, if I highlighted this range of data and I had O2 locked in with dollar signs, no matter how I dragged that formula, O2 would always be the first cell referenced. So even if I dragged it down further into say T12, and this was our reference table, if I had O2 locked, no matter what the range of my reference table changes to, it will always reference the X number that we enter for the number of columns from column O, value 2. I like to add the dollar signs in so that no matter what, my table array does not change. Then, if I drag my values over along the top, as you can see, it doesn't actually change anymore. It's always referencing med. The reason for this is it's looking at whatever values in cell A1 all the way across and matching that to whatever is in our table for the 17th column exported. The only thing I would have to change then is instead of 17 on the next column, I would want to reference value 18 and then value 19 and then 20 and so on and so forth. And I'm just gonna go ahead and put those numbers in if you're following along. And as we can see, when we enter 26, we get a reference error. That's because in our reference table, there were not even 26 cells out from our first column to reference. For example, just to explain it a little bit further, if I go to our reference data for this and drag all the way over, the cell range or the column range, as we can see from what I've highlighted, is 25 columns. So when I put in the 26th column, it didn't know what to reference because our reference table was only 26 columns or 25 columns long. Now that I have all that input, I don't have to worry about our column changing as I extend this down, and I want our row reference to change as I extend it down. So I highlight the range of our formula, double click, and now all of our references exactly match the lines that we're looking at. And now our working file matches more or less our reference file. Unfortunately, we're already at 1041, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get to the sample pivot tables, but if you have any questions or comments on anything that we've covered so far, I would highly recommend just sending me an email. That email you can send to tlevine@crnstone.com, and that will let you contact me, and I'll answer any questions you might have. Remember that we also have our individual corner coming up tomorrow, and we will be covering specifically nested functions coming up, as well as pivot tables, which we'll cover in section 3 because we didn't get to it here. And in addition to that, we will also be covering nested functions, like I said, and exactly how those references work. Looping back, we did already have a question. This was from Sherry Keefe. And this question was specifically, how do I add a filter or sort to my data? All I do is I highlight the whole range of data that I want to sort, click on Sort and Filter, and then go to Custom Sort. What this sort does is it then allows you to sort by any reference data. And then I'm going to hit OK. The order here is the order that you'd want the data to sort from. For instance, if I'm sorting on policy number, largest to smallest, it'll sort from the largest policy to the smallest. This data up here indicates that you have headers. I'm going to hit OK. And it sorted everything from our line number from largest to smallest. If I go into sort and filter, custom sort again, as you can see, I'm sorry, I wasn't referencing line number, I was referencing policy number. To make it a little more visible, if I do line and hit OK, it'll reference the line. I explained it in a little bit more detail, by the way, in our previous webinar. So if you want exactly more detail on that, I'd recommend looking it up there. I'm going to stay on for a few more minutes, by the way, if you have any questions or comments or concerns. So feel free to type them into that question box there. And once again, thank you for attending our Tech Tuesdays. I do hope you found it a little bit helpful.